The law of reciprocity is a deeply ingrained psychological principle that governs much of human behavior. And when used ethically, it becomes one of the most powerful tools of influence. At its core, reciprocity operates on a simple rule. When someone does something for us, we feel a subconscious need to return the favor. This isn't just social etiquette, it's hardwired into our neurology through evolutionary mechanisms designed to support cooperation and mutual survival. Ancient tribes that shared resources were more likely to thrive. Our brains evolved to remember favors and balance the scales. In modern settings, this plays out every day, when a friend pays for lunch and we feel an urge to cover the next meal, or when someone offers us help and we're more likely to listen to their requests. But when applied with intention, reciprocity can shape decisions, alliances, and even loyalty without the other person realizing why they're acting in your favor. Here's how this works in a practical educational context. Let's say you want someone to support your idea in a meeting. Instead of pushing your agenda up front, you start by helping them with their work or giving them credit for a past success. This gesture appears generous, but is actually strategic. You've now opened a psychological loop in their brain, a debt they feel compelled to close. And because our minds seek balance, they'll find subtle ways to support you, agree with your ideas, or prioritize your needs. Importantly, this works best when it's unexpected or unannounced. If your generosity is obvious or self-serving, the effect weakens. But if your action is framed as spontaneous and genuine, their subconscious begins working to reciprocate, often in ways they don't fully realize. Moreover, the principle of reciprocity is amplified by emotion and timing. When your act of giving solves a pressing problem, relieves stress, or makes someone feel seen or valued, it triggers a stronger need to repay. This is where deeper control emerges, not through dominance, but by consistently being the source of relief, value, or clarity. Over time, people begin to associate you with positive emotional experiences. They trust your judgment, they seek your approval, and when decisions must be made, your influence will weigh heavier, even if your words are few. Another layer to this dynamic is the idea of future reciprocity. When you build a reputation as someone who gives first, people begin to anticipate your generosity and preemptively align with you. This form of indirect influence doesn't even require active engagement. It's a psychological credit system you've built through repeated behavior. You've trained others to expect that proximity to you means benefit, and humans naturally protect and prioritize relationships that bring them value. Importantly, this should never be weaponized to manipulate. Reciprocity loses power when it feels transactional or exploitative. The most effective form of influence through this principle is when the other person believes their decision is autonomous and voluntary. When they feel gratitude instead of obligation, you've created a sustainable form of control, one where they willingly move in your direction without realizing they were nudged there in the first place. In essence, the law of reciprocity isn't about giving to get. It's about positioning yourself as a consistent force of value. When you do, people's minds begin to bend toward your favor, not out of fear, but because their brain quietly whispers, "I owe them something." When that whisper grows, decisions start to tilt in your direction, influence becomes effortless, control becomes invisible. The concept of mirroring, when applied with subtlety and precision, is one of the most underrated tools in the psychology of influence. It's rooted in neuroscience, specifically in the activity of mirror neurons, which are brain cells that fire not only when we perform an action, but also when we observe someone else performing an action. And then this means that when you reflect someone's behavior back to them in a non-obvious way, you're tapping directly into their subconscious, triggering a sense of familiarity, safety, and connection. It's why people naturally trust those who remind them of themselves. And trust, once established, becomes the foundation for long-term influence. Mirroring isn't about imitation in a robotic or exaggerated way. It's about tuning your body language, facial expressions, vocal tone, and even pacing of speech to align with the other person's. If they speak softly, lower your volume slightly. If they gesture expressively, let your body language open up. If they lean forward with interest, do the same. This creates what psychologists call nonverbal synchrony, a physiological rhythm that builds connection without words. Most people won't notice you're doing it, but their brain will. It will register you as safe, similar, and most importantly, trustworthy. Once that psychological bridge is built, resistance lowers, influence increases. There's also an emotional component to mirroring when you reflect not just gestures, but also emotional states, like responding calmly to anxiety or showing enthusiasm when they're excited. You validate their internal experience. Validation is a powerful psychological reward. It tells the other person, you're seen, you're understood, and we are naturally drawn to those who make us feel this way. In this way, you position yourself not just as a mirror, but as a safe space. People start to seek out your presence without consciously knowing why, and once they do, they're more receptive to your suggestions, ideas, and even subtle guidance. Mirroring also builds empathy, and empathy is a gateway to influence. When you physically or emotionally reflect someone's state, your brain starts to feel what they're feeling. This increases your ability to predict their needs and tailor your communication. When you know what someone is likely to feel or think next, you can stay one step ahead, guiding their focus, their trust, and eventually their decisions. Over time, they'll feel as if you just get them. That feeling is rare and valuable, and people protect those who provide it. In professional settings, mirroring enhances persuasion and negotiation. Salespeople, therapists, and leaders often use this technique without labeling it. When you mirror a client's skepticism with your own concern, then gradually shift into optimism, they follow your emotional lead. When you mirror a team member's frustration with understanding, then transition into constructive solutions, they align with your calm. The trick is not to stay in their state, but to match it first, then guide them out of it, what's often called pacing and leading. That's where real control lies. You join their internal rhythm, then slowly steer it. Importantly, mirroring should always be subtle and genuine. Overuse or mechanical application can create discomfort and suspicion, but when done skillfully, it builds a nonverbal bond stronger than most words can achieve. You're not forcing compliance, you're creating resonance. And once someone resonates with you, they begin to follow your emotional cues and conversational flow. Their defenses drop. Their brain says, this person is like me. And in that moment, influence becomes invisible but profound. Mirroring is not about manipulation, it's about understanding and alignment. And when you understand people on that level, their minds open to your guidance without even realizing it's happening. That's how influence begins, not with force, but with familiarity. Not with power, but with presence. Guiding people through the use of carefully framed questions is one of the most effective yet understated methods of influence. It gives the illusion of autonomy while gently nudging the mind in a desired direction. The brain responds very differently to questions compared to commands. When asked a question, especially one that is open-ended or framed with intention, the brain becomes active. It starts problem solving, visualizing, and imagining outcomes. This is key because if you tell someone what to do, their natural instinct may be to resist. But if you ask them a question that leads them toward the idea, they're more likely to internalize it as their own thought. This psychological shift transforms a suggestion into a self-generated conclusion, and people are far more committed to ideas they believe originated from within. This approach is deeply rooted in behavioral science and motivational psychology. Questions are powerful because they create cognitive dissonance in subtle ways. For instance, asking, what would happen if we tried it this way, doesn't impose a solution, it invites collaboration and introspection. The person being asked starts to visualize the potential outcome, weigh benefits, and often even begin justifying the course of action, all before realizing that the direction they're exploring is one you suggested. The resistance is bypassed not by force, but by curiosity. This is the art of invisible steering. Additionally, questions activate the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for decision-making and planning. When someone engages with a well-framed question, they shift into a more rational, future-oriented mindset. This is especially important when dealing with emotional resistance or hesitation. Instead of challenging them directly, you shift their perspective by inviting exploration. How would that affect your long-term goals? Or what's the best way to solve this without extra stress? These types of prompts don't confront, they open doors. The answer often aligns with the path you hoped they'd take, but now it feels like it was their choice all along. Another benefit of asking questions is that it builds rapport and respect. People naturally feel more valued when they're consulted rather than instructed. When you ask for input or feedback, you're granting someone psychological ownership. This sense of ownership increases their willingness to support an idea, defend it, or act on it. The dynamic shifts. You're not controlling them, you're empowering them within a framework you've created. Its subtle guidance, embedded in respect and the loyalty it breeds, is far deeper than what control by authority can ever achieve. Moreover, the structure of your question matters. Leading questions, when used ethically, can guide thought while preserving freedom. Do you think this method could help us avoid unnecessary delays? Positions the desired solution as the proactive one. Would it make sense to try this first before moving on? Softens the directive and gives space for agreement. People rarely push back against something they feel they chose. In truth, you shaped the decision by shaping the question. Even in conflict or negotiation, questions can diffuse tension. Instead of arguing a point, ask, what would need to change for you to feel comfortable with this? Now the person is working with you to solve the problem rather than standing against you. Step 1, you've reframed the moment and invited cooperation without ever raising your voice or asserting control. Ultimately, asking questions is an art of influence that respects the intelligence and autonomy of the other person. It works not by overpowering, but by co-creating outcomes within a structured mental space. When people arrive at decisions you subtly guided them to without ever feeling pressured, they're not just complying, they're committing. That's the difference between control that fades and influence that lasts. It's not about forcing people to see what you see, it's about helping them see it for themselves. Silence is one of the most powerful yet underestimated tools in human interaction, especially when it comes to influence. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. They rush to fill it with words, explanations, justifications, or responses. But when used strategically, silence becomes a force that commands attention, creates tension, and elevates the weight of your words. It's not just the absence of speech, it's the presence of control. The brain is wired to notice what breaks patterns, and silence in the middle of a conversation breaks the usual flow. It disrupts expectations, and in that disruption, you create a moment of psychological dominance without ever needing to raise your voice or assert your authority directly. When you use silence intentionally after making a statement, it signals confidence. You're not seeking validation, you're not filling space to make your point stronger, you're allowing the message to land. This pause tells the listener, consciously or unconsciously, that your words are important, that they carry weight. And because silence demands processing, the brain of the listener begins to focus more intensely on what you just said. They reflect, analyze, and often internalize your message more deeply simply because you gave it room to echo. This creates a sense of presence. Your words aren't just heard, they're felt. In conversations involving negotiation, persuasion, or emotional tension, silence becomes even more influential. For instance, when someone is resisting or trying to assert control, responding with a pause instead of immediate counterarguments throws them off balance, and they begin to question whether they've said too much, or if you're silently judging or evaluating their stance. In reality, you're simply holding space. But the psychological discomfort they feel often leads them to speak more, reveal more, or backtrack. This technique is frequently used in high-stakes negotiations and interviews because it causes the other party to fill the silence, often revealing their true intentions or offering concessions they wouldn't otherwise make. Silence can also be used to guide decision-making. After presenting an idea or request, instead of persuading further, remain silent. Let the weight of your proposal linger. The other person, driven by discomfort or a desire to resolve the pause, will often start rationalizing reasons to agree or take action. In their mind, they are convincing themselves, not being persuaded by you. This is key. Influence that leads someone to their own conclusion is far more effective than influence that feels externally imposed. And silence makes space for that internal dialogue to unfold. Another powerful dimension of silence is that it fosters presence. In a noisy, fast-paced world, those who are comfortable with quiet exude calm and control. When you use silence well, You appear thoughtful, composed, and emotionally secure, traits that naturally attract respect and authority. You're not trying to win through volume or speed. You're playing a deeper game, allowing the silence to do the heavy lifting. People will often lean in, both physically and psychologically, to fill that gap, bringing their attention, their curiosity, and their vulnerability with them. In emotional situations, silence also provides containment. When someone is upset, hurt, or frustrated, responding too quickly can escalate the emotion or appear dismissive, but silence, when paired with empathetic body language, holds space for their feelings. It says, "I'm here, I'm listening." This silent presence is often more powerful than any words of comfort or solution. And once the emotion softens, they become more receptive to what you have to say. Ultimately, silence isn't passive, it's an active strategy. It reflects mastery over your impulses, your need for control, and your emotional state. It tells others, "I don't need to push, you'll come to me." And very often they do, because silence creates a vacuum, and human nature abhors a vacuum. Use that pull wisely, and you can guide conversations, perceptions, and even decisions without saying a word. The human brain is not wired to remember every detail of what you say, but it will always remember how you made someone feel. This is the fundamental principle behind anchoring emotions to yourself, a method of influence that works on a deep neurological level. Emotional anchoring is about consistently associating your presence, your voice, or your interaction with specific emotional states that the other person finds rewarding. Over time, they begin to subconsciously link their experience of safety, joy, relief, inspiration, or validation with you. Once that association is formed, your influence grows organically because the brain is drawn to sources of positive emotion. People start to seek you out, trust your perspective, and prioritize your input, not because of logic alone, but because of the emotional pattern wired into their subconscious. This process isn't random. It requires intentional consistency. Every time you enter a space, how you show up emotionally matters. If you repeatedly offer reassurance when someone is anxious or clarity when they're confused, your presence becomes a mental cue for comfort or certainty. It's classical conditioning applied through human interaction. The brain learns that your presence predicts relief. And because humans are neurologically motivated to seek pleasure and avoid discomfort, they will naturally want to be near you, listen to you, and follow your lead. Not because they've been told to, but because their emotional system has been trained to associate you with what they want to feel. The key to anchoring emotions is timing. When someone is in an emotionally heightened state, especially vulnerable, overwhelmed, or excited, their brain is most impressionable if, during those moments, you provide something emotionally significant, like empathy, humor, grounding, or even silence. You create a powerful link. That moment gets encoded in memory, and your role in it becomes a mental shortcut. The next time they encounter similar feelings, their brain looks for what or who helped before, and if that was you, your influence activates. You don't have to say anything overt. Association has already been formed. Emotionally intelligent people naturally use this technique, often without realizing it. They know when to affirm, when to listen deeply, when to celebrate someone's wins with genuine enthusiasm, and when to just be a steady presence. These are not manipulations. They are contributions to someone's internal emotional regulation. And when you become a reliable source of that, your presence carries psychological weight. Even in your absence, people begin to think, "What would they say about this?" Or, "I wish they were here for this." That's emotional anchoring in full effect. It extends your influence beyond physical presence. In leadership, parenting, relationships, and negotiations, this principle is transformative. A leader who consistently brings clarity during chaos becomes the anchor. A friend who always offers humor in stressful times becomes the emotional refuge. A mentor who instills calm before difficult choices becomes the trusted guide. Over time, these roles translate into authority, quiet, lasting, and unchallenged, not because it was enforced, but because it was felt. One of the most overlooked aspects of this method is that negative emotions can also be anchored, and they often are. Unintentionally, if you're the person who criticizes when someone is already feeling low or who brings stress into tense moments, the brain links you to discomfort. And even if your intentions are pure, your influence will decrease because people will begin to avoid or resist you subconsciously. This is why emotional awareness is not just about empathy, it's about strategy. You must know not only what people feel, but what they want to feel, and position yourself accordingly. Ultimately, to control or influence someone without them knowing, you must become the person their nervous system trusts. Not the loudest, not the most logical, but the most emotionally consistent. Be the source of what they seek, and their mind will pull toward you like gravity. You won't have to persuade them with arguments. Their brain, wired by repeated emotional experience, will already have chosen you as the answer, as real control. Silent, psychological, and lasting growth influence often comes not from directly controlling a person, but from shaping the environment in which they make their decisions. This is one of the most subtle yet potent strategies of psychological influence, changing the context, not the individual. The human mind is highly sensitive to external cues, many of which we process unconsciously. These include spatial arrangements, social dynamics, timing, physical comfort, sensory stimuli, and even unspoken expectations. By intentionally designing or adjusting the environment in which interactions take place, you gain quiet control over how people feel, think, and behave, without them ever realizing it was engineered. Environment is more than a physical space, it's the total context. For example, if you want someone to agree with you, the time and setting matter. People are more agreeable when they're well-fed, relaxed, and feel socially safe. Having a conversation during a peaceful walk rather than in a tense office can completely change the outcome. Similarly, people tend to mirror the emotional tone of the room. If you manage the atmosphere, keeping it calm, warm, or focused, you subtly control how others engage, even without speaking much. In leadership, this is known as setting the emotional climate, and it's a powerful lever for shaping decisions and attitudes. The layout of physical space also carries psychological weight. Seating arrangements during meetings can establish hierarchy or invite collaboration. If you position yourself at the head of a table, you're silently asserting authority. If you sit beside someone rather than across from them, you create psychological closeness and reduce confrontation. Even the direction someone faces, toward a window, a door, or a group, can alter their focus and openness. These spatial cues speak to the primitive brain, which is always scanning for safety, control, and power dynamics. By adjusting the physical environment, you shape how people perceive their role, their choices, and your influence over them. Lighting, temperature, noise levels, and background visuals also affect perception and behavior. Warm lighting can make people feel more relaxed and receptive. Bright fluorescent lighting may heighten alertness but also tension. Playing soft, low-tempo music can reduce stress and increase trust in negotiation settings. All of these elements are environmental signals that bypass rational thought and speak directly to emotional and physiological states. If you're the one controlling or curating these sensory elements, you're influencing not just perception, but emotion and cognition, quietly guiding people towards certain states of mind. Another layer of environmental control is social framing. People behave differently depending on who else is present, how roles are defined, and what unspoken norms are in place. If you introduce someone as an expert before they speak, others will treat their words with more credibility. If you position an idea within a socially desirable narrative like innovation, responsibility, or unity, people are more likely to support it even if the core message hasn't changed. The key is that you're not forcing anyone to think differently. You're guiding the lens through which they view the situation. And that lens shapes every thought and choice that follows. This method is especially effective because people often don't realize how much the environment influences their decision. They believe they are acting independently, when in reality their behavior has been shaped by the context you carefully design. That's the essence of subtle control, guiding without force, directing without detection. When used ethically, it allows you to help others make better decisions, align with your goals, or collaborate more effectively, all without confrontation or resistance. By mastering environmental control, you position yourself not just as a participant in interaction, but as the architect of experience. And once you can shape the experience, you don't have to push anyone to follow your lead. Their choices will begin to align with the frame you've created. That's the quiet power of strategic influence, not in changing the person, but in changing the conditions around them until their natural response becomes the one you intended all along.